morning. Thank you for joining us on Lifting Your Spirit, a monthly broadcast in which we interview people about their spiritual lives and how they support others in lifting their spirits. I'm Reverend Joel Grossman, Interfaith Minister, chaplain with Constellation Hospice here in Newburyport, and I offer spiritual coaching on a donation basis virtually.
And I'm Ted Jones, and I'm a meditation teacher at North Shore Insight Meditation Center.
Our show is based on the following four principles. One, everyone is spiritual. Sometimes we are conscious and active in our spiritual life, sometimes not, but we're always spiritual.
And second, that there are many ways to lift your spirit, not only through formal religious practice, but also through nature, human relationships, service to others, just to name a few.
Third, each person's spiritual path is unique and may change in small or large ways over time.
And fourth, it's important to respect your own spiritual journey, trusting that one step leads to another, and to respect other people's unique spiritual journeys, regardless of how different they might be from your own. We're not here to convince you of any particular approach or method, but rather just offering food for thought. Today, we're very pleased to have with us as our guest, Reverend Jane Tuohy. Reverend Tuohy is an ordained interfaith minister and serves as an affiliate minister of the First Religious Society Unitarian Universalist in Newburyport. Jane was ordained in 2022 by the One Spirit Learning Alliance and Interfaith Seminary based in New York City. Since July 2021, she has been providing pastoral care services at Anna Jake's Hospital. Jane co-leads with Nancy Kidd a bereavement support group at Anna Jake's that's opened to members of the community. As an interfaith minister, Jane believes that each of the world's major religions have treasures and wisdom to offer, and that these are many paths to spiritual growth and development. As part of the Unitarian Universalist FRS community, she's involved in adult faith formation initiatives and offers interfaith programming. For the last 2 years, she has focused on interfaith exploration of mysticism and contemplative practice. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Joel. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning.
Good to have you.
We start off each of these interviews with just the question of what has your spiritual journey been, right from as far back as you can remember up to the present day?
Okay, thank you. Well, like you, Ted, I was raised as a Catholic, and I grew up in a very Catholic, Irish Catholic family, Irish Catholic community. My mother went to Mass 7 days a week for 40 years, and I grew up at St. Joseph's in Garden City, New York, so immersed. My family was very much immersed in the Catholic Church. And like many people, you know, there's much I value from that upbringing, but over time I came to have difficulties with the Catholic Church as an institution, and by the time I was 14, I started to be able to discern some discrepancies between what I was hearing from the priests in the pulpit and seeing enacted by the adults around me. But I stayed a Catholic, and I went to a Catholic women's college, and I mentioned that, Manhattanville College in New York. I mentioned that because it was really, it turned out to be incredibly important to me later on in life, because there I was educated by Sacred Heart nuns, who were very liberated people. They were female equivalents of Jesuits. They're highly educated. They taught critical thinking. And This was 1965 to 69. So these were tumultuous years.
Yes.
You gentlemen both are old enough to remember. And they became inspirational for me. They were the most independent, thoughtful, liberated women I had met to date. So they became kind of role models and opened me up to a lot of critical thinking that was a little bit surprising on my path as a Catholic. Nevertheless, I also was dealing with realizing that I was gay and coming to terms with that and what that meant. And back then, in those times, in those places, it was kind of a lonely place to be in the Catholic Church. And I will tell you some specific moments that seem to me to be like critical when I think about where were the turning points and where did I shift. And one was when I was a sophomore in college. I was in line for confession on a Friday afternoon. And this is the women's college, so there are lines of girls, young women waiting to go to confession. And from the confessional on the right, I heard a priest's voice yell out. I mean, yell. The acoustics in this place were very good. And he yelled, and what he yelled was, "That's fornication."
Whoa.
Yeah, that's right. And I remember standing up and turning around and walking out the door, and everybody, all the other women who were in the chapel with me, stood up and walked out the door.
Wow.
To save this poor young woman the incredible embarrassment of then having to walk out of this confession and walk down. And that was it. That was like, I'm done. So
I'm curious, I think that it was a major reason that I left the church was that sacrament of confession, and that it was always a very fraught, kind of painful experience.
yeah.
That didn't even seem that confidential when, even if the priest wasn't yelling. I mean, it wasn't like there was a soundproof booth and people sitting outside could sort of hear what was going on.
Well, I don't know about you, but from an early age, I would feel pressure, like
Yes.
to come up with my list of sins.
Yes, I'm resonating with that entirely.
I can remember my first confession. This is probably also my first clear memory of having performance anxiety. But I was so anxious because I couldn't think of any, I was like, 6, 7? I couldn't think of any sin that I had committed. So I was racking my brains trying to think of something. And so I went to confession, and I got, unfortunately for me, the priest who was perhaps not the brightest light on our Christmas tree. And I, said, "Bless me, Father, I have sinned." This is my first confession. And my sin was my parents were having a cocktail party, and they would put out these little silver bowls with nuts. And they said to us, the kids, they said, "Don't eat the nuts." So my first confession was, I stole a nut. And then the priest said to me, "What kind of a nut?" And I'm like, "Oh, God." I don't know. I'm failing my first confession. So there was that mixed feeling of, the minute after confession, I would think, "Oh, good, if I'm hit by a truck, straight line to heaven."
I'm still on the edge of my seat for the penance for eating a nut.
Would it vary depending on what kind of a nut? Yeah, so that was
those
it.
big Brazil nuts.
You're talking time.
Our fathers for that.
Right,
yes.
right. So, so I consciously I walked out of that chapel, and that was a moment in time because it was the beginning of my understanding that my future was not going to be with the institution of the Catholic Church, but still my faith was there. So it was like a first time that I started to understand that, and this would later on show up, that I could leave the Catholic Church, but hold on to my faith. So I left at that moment in time, but I was still very glad to be at this college because I had such liberated thinking professors, clergy and lay people as well. So that was, and there was, the core values of social justice were there. And this was in the late 60s, so things were erupting. So I left, And also, just being gay in that time, the Catholic Church was just not a welcoming place to be. So I left, and then I got into feminism and, channeled my energies into equal rights for women and gender issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then, when I left the church, unfortunately for me, I slammed the door on, the baby in the bathwater, out went the baby, and I stayed away for 30 years, and I feel angry. I still feel angry about that, because I feel like I was driven from. Of course, now I can say, well, I chose to leave, but I slammed the door, and I stayed far, far away for 30 years. I finally came back. So a message I would have for your listeners is, it's never too late. Don't give up on yourself. And we can find our spiritual centers, even if it's decades later, right? Mm-hmm. So eventually I snuck in sort of the back door of the Insight Meditation Society in West Newbury through meditation. So I started to meditate at the Insight Meditation Society. Then I got into a Buddhist book discussion group, and I started to go to Buddhist events there. And I did that for about 5 to 8 years. And I liked it a lot. I still have I consider myself to be a Buddhist in the sense that I have complete admiration and appreciation for the philosophy of Buddhism and the way of life. And one day I had lunch with a friend and client of mine. I was doing diversity and leadership consulting at the time. And the client was was a Catholic nun. She was a chaplain at Wellesley College. And she called herself a recovered Catholic, even though she was a Catholic chaplain. And she was one of the nuns on the bus. Remember the nuns who were doing protesting? At any rate, she's a politically active person. And we were talking about sort of where I was. And I said, yeah, and I'm missing something. There's something missing for me. And only what I could articulate at that time was I was missing shared worship, and I was missing a commitment to action. And also, I am of Irish descent, and the Buddhists tend to be kind of quiet. They're not talkers. At least they weren't talkers over at the Insight Meditation Society. So I'm from a culture where people are talkers. So she said, oh yeah, she understood that I was missing the rituals and the worship. And so that encouraged me to go over to the First Religious Society, Unitarian Universalist. And I had been in and out of there for a while because, they're very socially active people in the community of Newburyport. But I hadn't really fully connected. And I, at that point, decided that I would start going to FRS because of their social action committee and their commitment to justice, but there was still something missing for me. And that's what I did, And then there was a change in ministers, and the minister who had been there, I liked him very much and respected him, but I did not have a heart connection with him. And then Reverend Rebecca came in, and you both have met Reverend Rebecca. To do a quick plug for FRS, we'll celebrate our 300th anniversary in 2025. Mm-hmm. We had 22 settled ministers before Reverend Rebecca, all of whom were white men from New England, Harvard Divinity School educated, of a certain cloth,
All were Harvard?
All.
Wow.
Every single one of them. Wow. So then you bring in Reverend Rebecca, very, very, our first woman, not from Harvard Divinity School. You both know Rev Rebecca very well. And things started to change. She started opening up that church. And first bringing in a more heart, head, soul integrated model. Before, I would say we were a pretty intellectual, heady, somewhat traditional New England congregation. Reverend Rebecca started to open things up because she is herself, such an integrated person. She brought her emotions, her life into church and showed us it was okay to do that. And things really started opening up. And she started inviting people in a way that we hadn't been invited in before. So suddenly it wasn't just one, up till now, guy up there in that high pedestal, but all sorts of other people started being involved because she opened up Worship Associates and Pastoral Care Associates. So I was just thrilled, and it was such a blessing in my life because I was with her every step of the way. I was her installation chair before she came here. I started working with her, and it was just thrilling to see what was happening in our congregation. So through her, I got opportunities to start to get involved in worship design, and I found that I loved it. I felt like, I'm a New Yorker, and I felt like I had been invited backstage to see how the productions were put together, and it was like that, So I learned how to create worship services, and I started to experience community in the way that we just hadn't had it before. So that was thrilling. And at one point, I started to think about, well, what's next? I was sort of surprised that I liked worship as much as I did, but I really loved it. And so then I started to think about seminary, which, I am no youngster, as you can see. And at first I thought, oh, this is crazy. I'm way too old to do that. And I thought about, and I decided to start auditing courses at Harvard Theological Seminary. I got permission to audit some courses. At that point, I was thinking about Buddhist chaplaincy. So I was very fortunate. Once again, I got Cheryl Giles, who's just an amazing, amazing professor who runs the courses in Buddhist chaplaincy. So I started studying with Cheryl at Harvard Divinity, and she was another, like Reverend Rebecca, instrumental person, because she said to me about halfway through my first year, I watch you in the class, and I see you really are building relationships with of course everybody's younger than me, with the younger people, and she said, I don't know about you as a chaplain. She said, because my experience has been chaplaincy is often about the end of life. And I see you as being more of a whole life cycle person. I think you should think about ministry. So by that time, I'd been hearing about One Spirit. And I looked at chaplaincy programs elsewhere and seminaries elsewhere. But I also was a diversity consultant. I'm, very committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And One Spirit is the most diverse seminary you can imagine. Not just my classmates, and then when I say diverse, they're very diverse from an ethnic and racial perspective, but I mean it more from a religious and spiritual traditions. I mean, they came from every faith that I could imagine, many I hadn't even heard of before. And the faculty were like that too. So I thought, oh, this is the place for me. So I started seminary in September of 2019.
Right.
September 20, March 20, everything closes down. But One Spirit had been doing online programming for about 15 years. So they managed that transition smoothly once we went into COVID and everything kind of elsewhere shut down. But it meant that I did most of my seminary work online over the next couple of years. I met my classmates in person the week of ordination.
Wow.
Yeah. But it was a wonderful experience and just the perfect place for me to be.
Now, I noticed that it was in New York City,
right,
which is where you were from.
Correct.
And was that just a coincidence, or did that have a certain draw to it? And was there a kind of a disappointment that you weren't drawn to kind of connecting with people in New York, which
Yes.
is kind of
Yes,
the vibration
and
of
energy,
energy,
and different from Newburyport, much as I love Newburyport.
yes.
Yeah, absolutely, Ted. That's another great question, because my family's from New York on both sides of my family. I'm fifth generation on both sides of my family. So, I think there's a way of sort of connecting with my own history, my family history, and an important point of integration because of the diversity of New York City.
Yes.
Yeah, kind of got to do it my way.
Mm-hmm.
My parents got married in St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Wow.
In the chapel during the war.
Wow.
So there was a way of kind of reclaiming that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah. So, Jane, I'm really interested in hearing about that 30-year period where you weren't involved in the church.
Yeah.
What was feeding your spirit through those years? It wasn't religion, is
No,
what
it
you're
wasn't.
saying.
It
but
wasn't.
your spirit stayed alive.
My spirit stayed alive. Another great question. Thank you, Joel. I think it was in those years I was very involved in social justice. So, I was in that class from 1969. It was Hillary's class. And there was so much work to be done then, in terms of equality for women. So many laws. There were record numbers of women who became lawyers in my class. And I think it's because there were so many laws on the books that still needed to be changed. Women couldn't get a credit card in their own name, et cetera, et cetera. So I started when I was 29. I got on the train to be a speaker for the Women's for Equal Rights Amendment. I started speaking on that, and then I figured out I'd also finally dealt with being gay, gotten divorced. Now I'm a single parent. I got to support my family, and I figured out how to become a diversity consultant. So I'll tell you one quick story about that. So when I was going through divorce, I was sued by my former husband for custody of our children. And we went to court in Salem, Massachusetts. And this was before the time that sexual orientation was included in our state equal rights protection laws. So going to court in Salem was like, oh boy, scary, scary, scary. And I remember walking into this courthouse in Salem, and my attorney was wonderful, but we walked into the courtroom, and the judge, I was 31 or something. The judge appeared to be ancient beyond belief, like so
Probably our age now.
right. And he had on this. He was so old looking to me, and he was practically drooling, and he had a toupee that had slipped on the side of his head. So and I'm like, oh my God, this man has got the custody of my children at stake here. So I did a plea to God on the spot. I said, please, if I win this, I will spend the rest of my life fighting for equal rights and fighting against hatred and discrimination, because I had never been experiencing before being hated because of something that I was. And so that was such a shock, but also a wake-up call. So it was one of those crucible moments. So long time later, many dollars later, much stress and turmoil, I won that lawsuit, and I became a diversity consultant. So I spent the next 30 years really learning how to do institutional change and create social justice change in institutions, and I work primarily in higher education and nonprofit world, research medicine, et cetera. And so I learned about racism. We always worked in cross-race, cross-gender teams, and I started to spend a lot of time in communities where I was in a minority as a white person, and I started to learn how that all works, how hatred works, and what it takes to dismantle or even begin to dismantle and deal with, recognize systemic racism and things like that. So for me, lifting your spirits then was about being able to connect with people across those differences and get to our common humanity, beneath those differences, and be able to have conversations. So the merging of, this didn't come to me till later, but now when we talk about spirituality merging with social justice, that social justice is a reflection of our spiritual values. I kind of did that backwards. I got the action part first, and now going backwards, I can see how it is in fact a reflection of our. So
that's such an important point, and I'm thinking of Richard Rohr and the Center for Action and Contemplation, and hearing him speak once where he talked about when they set that up, they thought that they would be working, mostly with action and diversity issues and justice and stuff like that. And that what he soon realized is that they really needed the bigger emphasis on the contemplation side of it, because without that, the sort of fervor that can develop around issues of unfairness and injustice, if left completely untempered, can just sort of perpetuate the same problem in a different way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And think about, Ted, the parallels with where we are right now in this moment in time, right? It's like if we cannot talk to one another, if we can't find that common humanity underneath these political divisions that are dividing us and cultural divisions, it's really getting to that. And so I do see it as a sort of a journey towards spiritual wholeness. And you can start on the action side or you can start on the contemplation side, but you need both.
Yes.
And I think the social justice work, it's really helpful to put it into the context of what does this have to do with who I am spiritually? You know, and if we say that we, as I do as a Unitarian, you know, that there's a spark of divinity in each of us, and our first principle is to respect the dignity of each human being. Well, that means that we are brothers and sisters, and it is a journey towards spiritual wholeness to work on things like racism.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a kind of long-winded answer, Joel,
It's a beautiful answer.
that's kind of what I did in those years.
We talk about in our list of other approaches service, but this is a very particular, strong part of service, social action.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
beautiful.
And if we don't have for me, and I find this coming up a lot right now, if I don't keep that sort of groundedness in the spirituality of the unity of all people, I can in a minute be very much likely to other people who have different political views than I do,
Yes.
and very judgmental about them. So one of the classes that's coming up around mysticism, you know, we're looking at the philosophy and theology of Etty Hillesum. You might know of her, but she was a brilliant Dutch writer and philosopher and theologian living in Berlin. And she was in Berlin when Hitler was coming with his troops. And she had multiple opportunities to leave Germany, and she chose to stay. And then she had opportunity to escape the camps, and she decided to stay with her people, and she went into Auschwitz. And she was an atheist before she went there. And then she went there, and she found God. She talks about God coming to her and her coming to God. And in the camps, she realized that she had a calling, and her calling was, as a writer, to write about what she was observing and smuggle her writings out to get them published. So she became a writer writing about the heart, what she described the heart of being in the camps. So I think about, and what she came to was the understanding that even as she watched her family be murdered, and she was murdered before she was 29 years old. But she realized that she had to give up hating the Nazis. She had to forgive them. And she talked about our work is to purge ourselves of violence and hatred. And as long as she was hating the Nazis, so she said we have to come to the point where we are willing to destroy in ourselves what we would like to see destroyed in others. So I thought, my Lord, if that woman could do this in the camps. And now, fast forward to 2024, I just see where it's so, the media, you know, you're this or you're that, and these are bad people, and we're good people, and how could they possibly, you know, all of that is up again. So
Her name again is?
her name is Etty Hillesum.
Yeah, that's so powerful, Jane, and you know, that it really speaks to the sort of very kind of deep diversity, you know, that can you extend that even to people that you disagree with very strongly, recognizing that there is a common humanity that we're all sharing.
That's right, right.
Now, you mentioned the term mysticism
Right.
in classes. So
Yeah.
You want to say a bit about
Sure.
something Ted and I were both involved in?
Yes.
And thank you for your invitation.
Yeah. So as you know, gentlemen, we started a year ago exploration of interfaith exploration and mysticism at the Unitarian First Religious Society. I did that for purely. Oh, do you want me to say what I think mysticism is?
Yes, exactly.
Well, let's start by saying it's ineffable, meaning you cannot
Right.
describe in language.
Yeah, sorry to ask.
Well, it's one of the challenges of talking about mysticism, right? All the words are so inadequate. So I brought two definitions, actually, because I knew you would ask me that question. So one is from Howard Thurman. I don't know if I have that one here. Maybe I don't have it. But, okay. This is from Ken Wilber. Mysticism involves a belief that God is real and at work in your life, or having a clear sense of the world as operating in harmony with God's plan. Here's the one I was looking for, from Howard Thurman. For our purposes, then, mysticism is defined as the response of an individual to a personal encounter with God within his own spirit. So I will say, I think mysticism is about recognizing that there is a divine force, a sacred force operating and real. And if we open ourselves up, we can choose to have an attitude of opening ourselves, our hearts, and our minds to mystery. It's about mystery and being willing to be in the unknown. And I think as Westerners, we're not really comfortable being in the unknown a lot, but it's opening yourself to that mystery and trusting it. And because I'm a Christian, I will talk about God and personal relationship with God, but I recognize that many of my friends and colleagues, most of whom are Buddhists, they might be enlightenment. I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say or what you have to say, Joel, about that. But so mysticism is, I would say, an openness to welcoming the presence of the divine in your life and dwelling in mystery and seeking union and communion with the sacred. And it's often not an intellectual path. It's experiential. It's about attitude and openness. Yeah, that's what I would say about it. It's impossible to cultivate a mystical heart. And sometimes it's about direct personal experience with God. So I have a poem and a story I'll share, but am I okay on time?
Okay.
Okay, so I'll tell you my story and then I'll read you this quick poem.
Okay.
So here's my story. So there are, of course, big mystical experiences, many of which we know about from the Bible or sacred stories. And then there are little mystical experiences. But they're not within we don't command and call them up. We can't dial them up or order them, right? So 14 years ago, I was on the beach, my favorite beach up in Salisbury. And it was a beautiful, beautiful July day. The light was like this, you know how those July days can just be so perfect. And my daughter was in the ocean with my oldest grandchild, who was then 4. And I was at the edge of the water with the 2-year-old. So Niki, my daughter, is swinging Brela like this. They're swinging her in circles, and they both had long hair. So they're it was a beautiful vision of these two beings, mother and daughter, swinging around in circles with the waves breaking their long hair. And Drew was at my feet, and I would pick her up as the waves would come, and they'd go under her feet, and she'd laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. And suddenly, time stopped. Now, here's where the inevitable part comes in, right? It's hard to talk about what do I mean when I say time stopped. And the best I can do to explain this it was like being in the scene, seeing the scene, and being outside of the scene at the same time. And I was filled, everything got filled with this light and this incredible presence of warmth and love. It was overwhelming, suffusing everything, and tremendous sense of harmony. and peace. And there wasn't a person, but there was a presence. And there wasn't a voice, but there was a message. And the message was, all is well. And I had the sense of being held and taken care of. This always makes me cry, so I'll probably cry when I talk about this. But it was a tremendous experience of being loved and being held in love, and of this love pervading everything. And I think, now when I think about it, this is not too much after I'd come through that divorce experience. And I think I'd been so tense and so tight and so afraid for so long that I hadn't even realized how much I'd been consumed with that until it was gone. All of that was gone in that moment. So, and now I have to get a Kleenex. So that to me was a mystical experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Oh, sure. And, when I think about, how do I think about it now? I think it was the presence of God. I would say it was the presence of God. And it was a grace-infused moment.
Yes, it's so important what you were saying, that it's not something that we can attain or that
No.
we can even hang on to or grasp
No.
onto.
No.
That it is just grace.
And such a gift. Such a gift. Right. Yeah, so, when I trust my own experience and I can remember that, sometimes I forget.
Yes.
It's like,
Well, and it's a turning point to have an experience like that. And one of the questions that kind of haunts me is, because you can't really express it in words, is it even worth talking about with someone who hasn't had that experience? Because it can be described and it seems, that's great, but for someone who hasn't had that experience, it can be an abstraction, that it can be, well, that's something to think about.
oh, absolutely.
And that I
That's a
guess
really good
that's
question.
that's where it's like it's by grace that it occurs, and yet I think anybody who teaches as a spiritual teacher, as you are, spiritual practice kind of increases the likelihood or the possibility of that happening, because there's sort of you can't grasp it, but
You
can enough of the sort of story of me that we're carrying around, perseverating about in our own minds, that as that drops away, there's at least the openness for the possibility of that occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little version, to me, sort of a little version, not quite the same, but, and Joel, you might have experiences along these lines, but doing chaplaincy work, when I go to see patients, I pause before I go in and I pray that I will be an empty vessel. I just want to be an empty vessel, dial down my ego low enough that for the time that I'm with the patient, it's 100% about who is this patient, and trusting that if I can be present, then that's all I need to do, right? I don't need to figure anything out. I don't need to fix this patient. I don't, just if I can be present. And when that happens, it doesn't always happen, but when it does, the connection it's the same. Is it not, Joel? It's like that spirit, when there's a connection there, and I'm 100% present, but it is not about me. It's just about being there enough so that I can hear what this person really is saying and sense where are their strengths, where are their needs, where can we go here. Just the vehicle then. So to me, that's also presence. Maybe we could talk about mysticism as being open to presence in that way.
Yes.
But I just want to say that there's these special opportunities, the beautiful one you just shared, but it's happening all the time. It's happening with our family members. It's happening with our friends. We go to our men's group this morning and have breakfast together and share about our lives. And it's not astounding,
No.
but if we just stop and think about it, this was lovely.
Yeah.
That we're connecting.
Yeah.
You know, we're there for each other. And so I just want to say, for the question, is it even worth sharing for people who haven't had that experience? Just the notion that that's part of our lives. And sometimes we get hit with it, very special. But even if we don't have those...
And always available. And always available.
And always happening.
Yeah.
So
I think
that's another form of grace, just
Yes.
appreciating I'm here, we're going on.
Yeah, exactly. When I first joined the Unitarian Church, they used to talk about beloved community, and I would be like intellectually, yeah, but it was just a phrase. It was just a phrase. It didn't really mean that much to me. But now, 10 years later, 13 years later, and because of Reverend Rebecca in a lot of ways and all the changes that have come, that is a reality for me. You know, when I am on the pulpit and look out and I see this group of people, I know them individually because I've been there for a while and I love them, but there's something bigger. There's something bigger, and it is our collective presence, but it's also our collective presence and our openness in that moment to spirit. So sometimes, whether it's through the music at church or, you know, sometimes it's something special that we're doing like candlelight service, but mostly it's just
being there.
But it's real. There is something there that is beloved community that's bigger than the whole of the sum of us. Yeah.
In my daily prayers, I give thanks for gifts known and unknown. They're just happening, and I'm not even aware.
Right. That's right.
Consciously.
Right. Right. So can I read this poem?
Yeah, I was going to ask.
This is called Annunciation by Marie Howe. Even if I don't see it again, so I'm thinking about those big experiences, right? Even if I don't see it again, nor ever feel, I know it is, and that if it once hailed me, it ever does. And so it is myself I want to turn in that direction, not as towards a place, but it was a tilting within myself.
I like that.
As one turns a mirror to flash the light to where it isn't, I was blinded like that and swam in what shone at me, only able to endure it by being no one, and so specifically myself, I thought I would die from being loved like that.
Wow.
That's wonderful.
And who's that?
That's Marie Howe. It's called Annunciation. But I love that phrase about tilting within myself.
I love that term.
Yes.
Right? That's the openness that I think that we're talking about. Whether it's in a
Yes.
congregation or at your men's group or painting or seeing something new in your garden, you get that hit of unity.
Yeah.
Yes. And such a good example of what we were talking about before we went on the air, about how poetry can point the way toward that depth of experience in a way that just the regular
Or music, when we're
yes,
lost,
true.
we're all together in the same vibrational space that's beyond our linear capacities.
Yes. I like that, beyond a linear capacities. Yeah, I certainly fall prey to a lot of linear.
Yeah. So the mysticism class, which is coming up and is open to the community, it's actually called Mysticism and Contemplative Circles and Services, because I wanted to emphasize that this is not going to be, last year we did something that was, I'm very grateful to both of you, was more kind of laying some groundwork around interfaith exploration, and it was more, about intellectually understanding how different religious traditions understand mysticism, because I think mysticism underlies all religions. It doesn't belong to anybody, for sure.
Yes.
And because it's about our direct experience of the divine or the sacred, however we define that. I think it flows like a river underneath religious denominations, and it's nothing to do with dogma or even beliefs. It's much more about experience, and then how we try to open ourselves to let that, how we try to do that tilting within ourselves to let that light come through. So this year we're going to take it in a little bit different experience direction and focus more on experiences, practices that can help us open and share those practices and do them together, and not as much of a intellectual content. It's about opening ourselves up in sacred circle and trying different paths to transcendence, including music, including we're going to do a whole session on the theology of Eddie Hilsum. I'm doing the first session on, which is coming up on September 23rd, on mystical hope, which is, having to do with some of the concepts and understanding of hope beyond attachment to outcomes. So more experiential.
And if people are interested in getting involved, what do they do?
They could go to our website, which is First Religious Society, Unitarian Universalist in Newburyport, www.FRSUU, and it'll be on the website.
Okay.
Right.
So they look for what on the website?
If they go to the website, if they go to the Steeple, which is our newspaper, it's right there. Or people can also email me, which is janetoohy@frs.uu.org. Right.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we should probably hit that last question.
Okay.
Okay, which is how would you encourage, offer people to consider ways to lift their spirit?
Yeah, I liked your answer to that question, Ted, when you talked about going to the beach and the expansiveness in the sky and
Yes.
and that's my sacred place. I'd go there, but I thought I'd offer a different one because you'd offered that. And this one actually, this is a practice. It actually will sound paradoxical because it requires you to go through a few minutes of sadness before you get to the lift your spirits part. So the practice is when you're with your beloveds, your wife, husband, partner, spouse, children, grandchildren, best friend, partners, etc., to deliberately allow yourself to imagine that this might be the last time that you see them. And that's going to immediately bring up sadness, right? But then let yourself feel that for a minute or two. Then shift to how much you love this person and why you love this person so much, and let yourself just feel that love and that appreciation of who they are. And then say a quick prayer or meditation of gratitude that you have this wonderful life and this person to love. That's the whole practice. And I think, it's a little bit of a emotional roller coaster because as soon as you think, oh my God, this is the last, immediately that sadness for me comes up. But then I'm so happy they're here and I have this day and hopefully tomorrow and hopefully the next day, and maybe I don't get so annoyed that my grandson left his computer at home again.
Okay, you one more time take us through those steps?
Sure. So the first step is deliberately when you're with your beloveds, allow yourself to imagine that this might be the last time you see them. And you will experience great sadness. So knowing that, can you let yourself breathe into it, feel that sadness for a couple of minutes, and then switch gears and focus on how much you love this person, how much you love them, and why you love them so much. And then you say a prayer of gratitude or meditation, thanking for having your life and having this person to love.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yes, that's extraordinary, and a wonderful practice that reveals that grief and joy, two sides of the same coin, and the spiritual journey requires really welcoming in both sides.
Oh, absolutely. And how many traditions do we all hear from all the traditions that we must die 1,000 times before we die, right?
Yes.
And I always understand that as You have to learn how to get that dimmer going on the ego and be able to dim it down enough that we can get beyond it momentarily. And I think when we allow ourselves to experience the pain, really the suffering, I mean, to be human is to suffer. To love is to suffer. So to let ourselves feel both sides, the suffering that's going to come with separation, but at the same time, the joy. I think it helps us get ready for inevitably it someday will transition, right?
Right.
And maybe be a little more patient in between now and then.
Well, I think that's an excellent thought to end on. Jane, this has really been wonderful having you here.
Thank you,
It's been
Ted.
a real pleasure.
Well,
Thanks
it's
for
really great to
coming.
just have this time to talk with you and your listeners too, but you and I, we usually see each other coming and going, so this is really wonderful. Thank you both.
Good, thank you. And thank you for listening, watching, and hope you join us again next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.